In approximately 30 AD, Jesus of Nazareth looked at one of the most magnificent buildings in the ancient world and said it would be completely demolished. Not damaged, not partially destroyed, not left in ruin. Every stone thrown down, not one left on another. 40 years later, the Roman army tore it apart stone by stone, looking for the gold that had melted between the joints. What Jesus predicted and what happened, and the interval between them, is one of the most precisely documented prophecy fulfillments in all of antiquity. The specific prediction survives in 3 separate gospel accounts written before the event occurred. The fulfillment is recorded by a non-Christian Jewish historian who was present at the siege and had no theological interest in confirming anything. The Roman state commemorated the destruction on coins minted and distributed across the entire empire, and the number in the gap, 40 years, is not a detail that requires theological interpretation to notice. It appears throughout the Hebrew Bible in a pattern so consistent that the disciples Jesus was speaking to would have recognized it immediately. The number had meaning before it appeared in this gap. Before we walk through what happened in 70 AD, we need to understand what the disciples were looking at when Jesus said it. The temple Jesus and his disciples knew was Herod's expansion of the Second Temple, a construction project that Herod the Great began around 20 BC and that was still being finished in the decades after his death. Herod was not a devout Jew. He was a political operator who understood the power of monumental architecture. He doubled and then tripled the Temple Mount platform by constructing massive retaining walls and filling in the area behind them. The temple building itself was refaced and expanded. The royal Stoa colonnade running along the southern edge was large enough to hold thousands of people. Josephus, writing about the completed complex, describes the front face covered in gold plates that reflected the rising sun so intensely that visitors approaching from the east had to look away. The white limestone of the walls gleamed. Seen from the Mount of Olives, the whole structure appeared as a mountain of snow capped with gold. The disciples who pointed it out were not provincial men encountering impressive architecture for the first time. They had made annual pilgrimages to Jerusalem their entire lives. They knew this building, and still they felt compelled to gesture at it. Jesus' response required no pause. Matthew 24:2. Do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all record the conversation that follows. The disciples ask when this will happen and what signs to look for. What Jesus says in response is the longest extended discussion of future events in any of the 4 Gospels. But the core prediction is specific and falsifiable. Not one stone, everyone thrown down. Luke 19:41-44 records an earlier moment from the same week. Jesus is on the descent from the Mount of Olives, approaching Jerusalem. He stops and weeps over the city. His words while weeping are operational in their detail. The days will come upon you when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. They will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls. They will not leave one stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. An embankment, encirclement from all sides, children within the walls, not one stone on another. When Titus arrived outside Jerusalem in 70 AD, he built precisely the siege works Jesus described in Luke 19, a wall encircling the entire city to prevent escape and resupply. The tactic was standard Roman siege warfare. Jesus named it 40 years before it was used against that specific city. One detail establishes that this prediction was widely known within years, not decades, of the crucifixion. Acts 6:13-14. Stephen is brought before the Sanhedrin in approximately 34 AD. False witnesses are called against him. Their accusation is specific and telling. We have heard him say that this Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us. 4 years after the crucifixion, Jerusalem, the ruling council, Jesus' prediction about the temple's destruction was already so widely known and discussed that his opponents were using it as a legal charge against his followers in a capital case. It was not a minor saying circulating among insiders. It was being cited in court in the city where the temple stood. The prophecy did not need to wait 40 years to be recorded. It was in active use as a talking point in Jerusalem within the generation that would see it fulfilled, and those who used it against Stephen clearly understood it as a real prediction about a real building. Not a metaphor, not poetry, but a specific claim about what would happen to those enormous stones. 70 AD minus 30 AD equals 40 years. The crucifixion date is debated. The scholarly range is 30 to 33 AD, with most contemporary historians favoring dates toward the earlier end of that range. If the crucifixion was in 30 AD, the interval to the temple's destruction is exactly 40 years. If in 33 AD, it is 37. The script acknowledges this range honestly, because the argument does not require mathematical precision. It requires pattern recognition, and the pattern is hard to miss. Genesis 7:4. Noah is told that in 7 days it will rain for 40 days and 40 nights. The flood that ends one era and begins another lasts 40 days. Numbers 14:33-34. Israel's consequence for failing to enter the promised land is 40 years of wilderness wandering. Deuteronomy 8:2 gives the theological interpretation directly. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble and test you, to know what was in your heart. 40 years, testing, transition between eras. Exodus 24:18. Moses is on the mountain with God for 40 days and 40 nights. The law is given. A new era begins. 1 Kings 19:8. Elijah travels 40 days to the mountain of God after the Carmel confrontation. Something is ending. Something is beginning. Matthew 4:2. Jesus spends 40 days in the wilderness before his public ministry. He comes out the other side and calls his first disciples. Acts 1:3. After the resurrection, Jesus appears to the disciples for 40 days before the ascension. 40 days of transition between his death and the beginning of the church's mission. The pattern holds across 15 centuries of biblical text. 40 marks a period of testing or transition, long enough for something to end, short enough to remain within a human lifetime. It is the biblical measure of a generation, 40 years from the crucifixion to the temple's destruction. The gap that the Hebrew tradition had been marking long before it appeared between these two events. Matthew 24:34. Embedded in the same discourse where Jesus predicts the temple's fall, he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened." This generation, the people standing in front of him that afternoon outside the temple, not a distant future generation, not a theological category. The people whose faces he could see, a generation in biblical usage is consistently associated with 40 years. Numbers 32:13. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years, until the whole generation of those who had done evil in his sight was gone. One generation. 40 years. Then the transition to the next chapter. Jesus is addressing the people who had just pointed out the temple buildings. He says before their generation passes, these things will happen. Within 40 years, within the generation Jesus named, the temple fell. Matthew 24:34 is one of the most disputed verses in the discourse. Some argue that not all of what Jesus describes in Matthew 24 was fulfilled in 70 AD. That debate has continued for centuries. But for the specific question the disciples asked, when will the temple fall? Jesus gave a timeline. This generation, and the temple fell within it. The theological significance of the gap is not just numerical. In the Hebrew Bible, a period of 40 in the wilderness is not punishment alone. It is also transition. The generation that left Egypt had to pass before the next generation could enter the land. Or no, but those 40 years were not empty. They were the period in which the covenant was given, in which Israel was shaped into a people, in which something was offered and tested before the next chapter began. The 40 years between the crucifixion and the temple's destruction were years of active proclamation. The book of Acts records the apostles in Jerusalem, in Judea, in Samaria, across the Mediterranean world, in Rome. A generation heard what Peter said at Pentecost, what Paul preached in synagogues across the diaspora, what the first communities taught in city after city. A generation had the window. The gap was not a delay or a failure to act. In the pattern the Hebrew scriptures had established across 1,000 years, 40 was the measured span before the transition arrived, long enough for a generation to respond, short enough to remain within living memory of what had happened. When the window closed, the armies arrived. Luke 21:20-21. When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city. A specific trigger, a specific response. In 66 AD, 36 years after the crucifixion, the Jewish revolt against Rome began. The Roman general Cestius Gallus marched on Jerusalem with a substantial force. He reached the city, breached the northern wall, and then withdrew. The strategic reasons for the withdrawal are debated by military historians. From the perspective of the Jerusalem Christians who had grown up with Luke 21, the sequence looked like what Jesus had described: armies surrounding the city, then a window. Eusebius of Caesarea records what happened next. The members of the Jerusalem church were ordered to leave the city before the war escalated and settle in a city of Perea called Pella. Pella was east of the Jordan River, safely outside the coming war zone. The Christians went. When Titus arrived in 70 AD with 4 legions and this time did not withdraw, Jerusalem was surrounded, sealed, and starved. The famine inside the walls became catastrophic. The siege lasted 5 months. Josephus records scenes from inside the city during the famine that are difficult to read. The Christians who had remembered what Jesus said and left in 66 AD were in Pella. A prophecy remembered and acted upon within a generation saved an entire community. Not because the action was heroic, because someone had said, "When you see the armies, go." And they went. Titus arrived in April 70 AD with 4 Roman legions. He built the encirclement walls outside Jerusalem that cut off all escape and resupply. The embankment Jesus had described in Luke 19, constructed exactly as predicted around exactly the city Jesus had wept over. Inside Jerusalem, rival Jewish rebel factions fought each other for control of the city while the population starved. Josephus, watching from the Roman side, records the internal fighting alongside the famine in detail that is sometimes harrowing. The temple caught fire in August. Josephus's account of how the fire started is somewhat confused. Different sources say different things about Titus's intentions, but the result was beyond dispute. The gold that had been fixed to the ceiling and walls melted and ran between the stone joints. Then the soldiers did what soldiers who had been in a brutal 5-month siege do when there is gold in the stone joints. They took the stones apart. Josephus records the scene. Gold in the mortar. Stone by stone, soldiers pried apart what the fire had not fully consumed. Semine, not one stone left on another. The gold had made sure of that. Every visitor to Jerusalem today can stand at the Western Wall and touch massive Herodian stones that are very much on top of each other. The question is worth asking directly. Didn't Jesus say not one stone would be left on another? The answer requires a distinction that is architectural, but important. The Western Wall is not the temple. It is a retaining wall, part of the platform Herod built to extend the Temple Mount. It held the fill that created the expanded surface on which the temple complex stood. It was never part of the sanctuary, the courts, or any of the structures the disciples were gesturing toward. What Jesus pointed to when the disciples admired the buildings was the temple complex above the platform. The sanctuary, the courts, the colonnades, the gleaming gold facade that made pilgrims look away. That structure is gone. The retaining wall beneath the platform remains. The stones Jesus was describing, the ones the disciples were looking at, were thrown down. The wall that held the dirt under those stones is still standing. Here is the kind of historical confirmation that requires no faith to evaluate. After the siege, the Roman state commemorated the victory. Titus had coins minted, distributed across the entire empire from Britain to Mesopotamia, bearing a specific image: a weeping woman seated beneath a palm tree, a Roman soldier standing beside her. The inscription, Judea capta, Judea captured. These coins still exist in museum collections today. Anyone in any province of the Roman Empire who handled one knew the Jewish capital had fallen. The temple was gone. Rome had taken it. The Roman propaganda apparatus, with no interest whatsoever in confirming biblical prophecy, circulated visual documentation of the fulfillment across the ancient world in a form that has lasted 2,000 years. Judea capta coins turn up in archaeological digs, private collections, and museum cases across Europe. The destruction Jesus predicted became the image Rome chose to represent its greatest Eastern victory. If reading the prophecy of the temple's destruction with these specifics is new, the 40-year pattern, the Acts 6 early citation, the 66 AD flight to Pella, the Judea capta coins, this is what this channel is for. We go back to the original text and read what is actually there. Subscribe if this kind of material is useful to you. And if you know someone who has wondered whether Jesus' specific predictions were ever concretely fulfilled in history, send this video to them. The answer is documented in 3 gospel accounts, confirmed on Roman imperial coinage, and recorded by a Jewish historian who was watching from the Roman side of the siege. Jewish tradition records that the Second Temple was destroyed on the 9th of Avi, Tisha B'Av, the same calendar day on which the First Temple was destroyed by Babylon in 586 BC. This tradition is preserved in the Talmud and has been observed as a day of mourning in Judaism for 2,000 years. Josephus places the fire a day later, on the 10th of Avi rather than the 9th. He notes that the Second Temple burned in the same month as the first, and draws attention to the coincidence of the timing. The Talmudic tradition and the eyewitness account agree on the month. They differ by 1 day. Whether the fires fell on the 9th or the 10th, the proximity was close enough that both the Talmud and the eyewitness historian noticed and recorded it. The same month, the same consequence. 2 buildings representing the same covenant, destroyed by different empires, arriving at the same point on the calendar 6 centuries apart. What Babylon did to Solomon's temple, Rome did to Herod's temple. In the same month, at the same season, for the same reason. The prophets had named both times. The covenant had not been kept. One piece of this story carries an emotional weight that is easy to pass over in a discussion focused on historical documentation. Luke 19:41-44. Jesus is on the descent from the Mount of Olives, approaching Jerusalem for the last week of his life. he can see the city spread below him. The triumphal entry is about to begin, crowds coming out with branches, singing. And Jesus stops, and he weeps. As he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. He knows what is coming. He has just described it, the embankment, the encirclement, the children within the walls. And his response is not strategic foresight or theological detachment. He weeps. He says, "If you, even you, had only known on this day what would bring you peace. But now, it is hidden from your eyes." The prediction in Luke 19 is not delivered from a distance. It is delivered while its speaker is mourning the city he is predicting the destruction of. Jesus does not announce the temple's fall with efficiency or satisfaction. He says it while grieving for a city and a people whose suffering he already sees. The temple he wept over fell the way he said it would. The city he was mourning was surrounded, starved, and demolished within the generation of the people who saw him weep on the road. The primary historian of the temple's destruction was not a Christian. He had every professional reason to frame events as Roman military achievement rather than fulfilled Jewish prophecy. Josephus was a Jewish priest and military commander who fought in the revolt, surrendered to Vespasian, predicted Vespasian's rise to emperor correctly, and spent the rest of his life in Rome writing history under Roman patronage. He was interested in recording events credibly for a Roman audience, not in confirming anything a Galilean teacher had said 40 years earlier. His account confirms the siege works, the encirclement, the famine inside the walls, Dinam, the fire, the demolition of the stones. He notes the timing, the same month as the first temple's destruction. He records the gold running between the stones and the soldiers dismantling what the fire left. He does not connect any of this to Matthew 24 or Luke 19. He just writes what he saw. That is precisely what makes his account valuable. A hostile or indifferent witness confirming the details of a prediction he had no interest in verifying is worth more as historical evidence than any number of sympathetic accounts. Jesus looked at the temple and said, every stone would be thrown down. Before the generations standing in front of him passed, 40 years, the measure of a generation across 1,000 years of biblical text. The interval of the flood, the wilderness, Moses on the mountain, Elijah's journey, Jesus in the desert, 40 days of resurrection appearances, the consistent marker of a period of testing before the next era begins. Within those 40 years, the prediction was being cited in Jerusalem court proceedings. Christians recognized the signal when armies appeared in 66 AD and left for Pella before the final siege arrived. In 70 AD, Titus built the encirclement Jesus had described, burned the temple, and had the stones dismantled for the gold inside them. Roman coins carried the image of the defeat across the empire. A Jewish historian on the Roman side of the siege wrote the account. Jewish tradition recorded the month on the calendar and has fasted on that date for 2,000 years. Not one stone on another. This generation, both true, both documented. The prediction made publicly, cited in legal proceedings within 4 years, acted on by a community that survived because they took it seriously, confirmed by an empire that had no stake in the theological implications. The number in the gap is 40. In the tradition that gave this prophecy its context, 40 marks a generation, the measured span of one era's end before the next begins. Jesus spoke the prediction. The gap is 40 years. The stones were thrown down. Subscribe. God bless you.